So yeah, this is very kind of informal, I suppose. So please, feel free to chime in if you have any questions. Um, yeah, what else can I say to, I guess, set this chapter up, Mark? What would you say?
I mean, this is an interesting chapter because we don't really talk too much about Kubernetes in it. I mean, we launch Kubernetes. We run Istio in Kubernetes,
Mhm.
but really, this is one of those chapters where Kubernetes takes a big back seat, and really the focus is the service mesh, and we don't try to make this like because like you said, Chad, like I mean, there are multiple books on Istio. It's an incredibly complex system.
Hmm.
um, the goal of this chapter was really, hey, you've never used it before, you want to get up and running and start, kicking the tires, and in a way that is maybe a little independent of the way uh, some service meshes are really tightly bound to a specific product implementation or a specific cloud, and not knocking anybody, just we want to just learn Istio and get started on Istio in the simplest way how. um,
Hmm.
and there are a couple of parts of this chapter that I really enjoyed. um, One of them was the way that Scott really broke down the different planes, the way Istio kind of talks to each other. I know when I first got started with Istio, uh, I started my Kubernetes journey with good old Ingress Nginx, right? Like this
Mhm.
beautiful monolith that just worked. You didn't really have to think too hard about it. Um, And like when I started working with Istio, I was like, what do you mean there are different virtual gateways, and they're like what, like I have to figure out how these different things fit together, and like even something as simple as like, hey, I'm gonna how do I make sure that Istio uses HTTPS down to my remote resource,
Hmm.
outside of its default, right? Like, so it got kind of interesting, and so I think Scott, who drove most of this chapter, really did a great job of breaking that down. Oh, there he is. Oh, Scott, I know you said you had a cold. You,
Yeah, the call ended, so I managed to get over. So appreciate that. Thanks, Mark.
um, but
But
yeah, like,
yeah, I think like you were saying too, Mark and Chad, when you said that it would be a whole book. Right? I know what I try to challenge. People always say I want to turn on service mesh. I'm like, are you sure? Because there's a lot to know, and things could break. Right, and that's what we try to address in this, right, Mark? Especially the fact of everything assumes it's in the mesh, right, by default potentially. So you try to connect to an Oracle database. Next thing you know, you're getting connections denied. Think what's going on. Um, it's great, obviously, for observability, and that's what I'm sure we'll get into some discussions. But sorry, Mark, didn't mean to jump in too quick.
no, just I so yeah, so the thing I really love about this chapter is it gives great overviews. I mean, the first 15 pages, 10, 15 pages are like, hey, here are the different concepts, here are the things you need to know, here's how they fit together. um a lot of the details that like you would get if you were to really dig into the documentation, but without a lot of context, this gives you a lot of that context, um which I thought was a really great way to go about it. The other thing that I know can be infuriating about Istio is, do you deploy it with a Helm chart? Do you deploy it with Istio control? Do you make sure to arrange your sacrifices so that they happen on a full moon, to make sure that they get deployed correctly? So I also like the fact that this chapter like really gives you a nice step-by-step of like, hey, you want a development environment, like this isn't for production, but a environment where you can start messing and learning with Istio. I think this did a great job.
Awesome. I just want to mention how cool it is that we have both the authors, joining the call here to kind of walk us through this. And that was a beautiful introduction. And I think that helps a lot of people wrap their head around what Istio is and kind of what they're getting themselves into in terms of the complexities. So let's give the people what they came for, and I'll pass it over to you, Mark, and you can, or Scott, you can share your screen. And
well, we've never done that one before.
Yeah.
Usually,
do I have a working? I got my up the nose cam because of the way my I just upgraded my Mac, and for some reason my plug-in webcam is not getting recognized. Where'd y'all go? Okay, there you are.
It's those techie things, Mark.
I can definitely share my screen too if that works better for you. So
yeah, I'm just trying to think if we got I guess we could probably run through the book exercises. Do we want to do that? Is there anything like
the topics?
Yeah. Is there anything that the folks at home want to like hear or talk about?
I'm interested in your presentation and everything you want to say, but I don't want to get too sidetracked. I'm interested in the evolution of Istio to support the non-sidecar mode. What was it called? The ambient.
Ambient mesh.
And your commentary on that is this a should I drop everything and move to ambient? I don't want you to skip the whole. I want to see your whole presentation, but it's gnawing at me that it sounds like a fork in the road on Istio, and I wanted to get your perspective on it as well. Just add that to your list of topics to cover.
Well, no, it's a good introduction, actually. I think, Jack, to get into it, as Mark can look for some stuff too. So we kind of mention it in the chapter, but we literally mention, all right, because I didn't want to get into the weeds on it. So if you're asking me, I'm very excited for it. Let's put it that way. But I don't know if it's fully baked for production at this point in time yet. It's still relatively new, but some of the concepts are just great, right? No sidecars is great. I mean, the resources that our sidecar can take that you got to assign adds up. I can't get into those details, but I just did it at our infrastructure at our size, and it's sizable. It's just more to maintain. You got to spin it up. So the ambient has some really good advantages in that. It's going to be a learning curve, right? I like to give times a little bit more. It's a huge fork in the road, like you said. It's like a rewrite when you're dealing with that. So I like to let it bake a little bit longer rather than be the guinea pig in a lot of that. So it's been on my list for about 8 months now I gotta consider what we'll get into for it. There's some great presentations out there for it too.
I saw one at KubeCon, and it made me like, is it a fear of missing out, or is it too new to touch? I don't know.
The geek in me would be like, let's deploy it, right? And then I think, yeah, that goes down. We got problems.
Okay.
But yeah, we can, as a fast introduction part for it. And in case anybody that's else watching here, it's just I don't want to say it's just, there's a lot to it, but gets rid of the sidecar, right? So if you know what the sidecar is, and I'm sure Mark will bring this up as we're talking, and you can see the pluses and the minuses of the sidecar. Sidecar works great for when it came out, but as it scales, it gets to be a big beast all around.
I have one remark, Scott, regarding that. For ambient Istio, the problem is there is no direct migration from sidecar to sidecarless, so it needs like a fresh installation. So for example, in our case, if you are already in production and you want to use ambient, you need to like get rid of everything and then reinstall it, which is not a good idea.
That is a very good point, actually. Yeah, absolutely. Because even like in Istio upgrades, I'm a big fan of the canary control plane. Which gives us that time to upgrade, because of course relabeling your namespaces for the version, potentially restarting your pods, you wouldn't have that ability. I think you can run them side by side as different entities, but then you'd have a different ingress rule.
You need like a blue-green or like canary, something like that.
Yeah, definitely. That's a very good point to bring up.
Yeah.
Um,
Because I remember the maintainer said that now it's beta, but they are planning in the general available 1GA that they will have like some kind of migration plan from the sidecar to sidecarless to avoid that. But now it's not.
Yeah.
yeah, Alan, I see you got your hand raised there.
Hey, Mark, Scott, and everybody. Yes, I kind of wanted to hear a little bit while we get into the content of the chapter. And Scott, you mentioned you deployed it at scale where you work. What some of the key benefits or the reasons why you are deploying service mesh? I love the quote at the beginning about it's probably complex in the back end. That's why I've stayed away from like really diving into Istio. It's just like I don't have the bandwidth right now and mindset to jump into something so complex. But I want to understand some of those benefits that maybe you're seeing in the wild with users that need it, or was it just a nice shiny way of doing a lot of this extra service? Yeah.
Good point. I mean, Mark, and I think we'll have some of this, Mark, right when you're going through parts of the chapter because of some of the, I'm going to say some of the resources and objects that Istio includes, right, that make some of this easy. You know, you'll hear mTLS a lot, right? I'll get them encrypted. That's great, but you can do that with much smaller implementations. It is a great feature for it, but it shouldn't be the only reason you deploy Istio. I actually really love the observability of it too, right? I mean, when you're breaking down your monolith down to a microservice and you've got, say, 50 microservices, somebody calls you and says it's slow. Which one? Right? Going in to go, what the heck? I love Kiali, right, with using Jaeger and being able to play back my traces and say, okay, cool, look at that. That's a huge millisecond delay in this one portion, and I can see it in real time. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's other tools for that and other things as well, but this is just part of it. Canary deployments, again, something you could force into an ingress type of idea with Nginx, just not quite as easy. The authorization, something that I know the chapter follows this for Istio. As Mark said, I did a lot of this one. Mark did that one from that application background of authentication. So let's only let you into that virtual service if your JOT token has, you know, this stamped on it. You know, you've also got, of course, the mTLS outside the cluster, right? This is not just microservices. You can have VMs join this. They're streamlining that quite a bit. It used to be kind of a nightmare in the past. Yeah, I'm trying to think of, it's just all those cool features in it, the security, the deployment models, cross-cluster service mesh. We don't really get into it in the book. In the previous edition, I actually made, I added into our Git repo a cross-cluster mesh kind of test. Can't use kind for it. I think I was using kubeadm for it, but I'll probably move it into the third edition. We call them excursions, trying to keep up with like the nautical type of theme. And it's the extra stuff that we wanted to add that was after the book. But that is a great thing because now you've got your two different clusters where if something fails in prod, we'll say the services can just kind of pull from the other side. That's a great feature. There's a lot to think about in that, but it works incredibly well. So hopefully that helps a little bit, Alan.
One of the things that I find really interesting about service mesh, and this gets back to the question of ambient as well, is I come from it from a little bit of a different perspective because I'm coming at it from an applications perspective. I'm on that side of things, and where I find it really interesting is the border between east-west and north-south when it comes to traffic and authentication authorization. So like a lot of times what you'll see is, you'll have a gateway API sitting in front of clusters, and then you'll have a mesh inside of clusters. So you'll have the gateway API managing access across the clusters and into the clusters, but then you'll have a mesh inside the cluster for doing east-west traffic. And when I say east-west versus north-south, east-west, you're in the cluster, you're one service in a cluster talking to another service in the cluster. And that's usually going to happen via mTLS, mutual TLS. What is interesting about Istio, though, is that it adds this layer 7 capability of doing token-based authorization with JOTs and also token-based authorization with JOTs. So we'll get into this more in the next chapter, but it gives you almost a API gateway light, right? And so just talking ahead, pontificating, I almost wonder if there's a point in time in the future where Istio just goes full API gateway and tries to compete on that layer as well, because you can if you're just going for the I want to have mTLS for everything, Linkerd would probably be easier.
You can even encrypt with Cilium or something too, right?
Yeah,
If you want to do encryption based.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of them. I saw one guy on Reddit wrote his own service mesh over the weekend. Yeah, I'm sure it's probably not the most production ready thing in the world, but if you're just looking for mTLS everywhere, there's probably easier ways than a service mesh. So it's definitely an interesting space. Like at KubeCon, I think it was Solo open sourced their Istio implementation. I've got absolutely no anything with Solo. I've never tried it, but that was interesting that they were they open sourced their Istio. I have no idea how it compares to.
I think it's pretty much the same almost, but it's great because they offer you support, right? Because that's the tough thing in an open source project is you want to run it in production. Who's going to help you? And there's certain things that I think you need support on. Service mesh is one. I really think you need that escalation and not going to a Slack channel or issues, right? And tell your management, I'm gonna get an answer in 3 days, potentially, right? Or if there's a bug. So they're popular for that. I know. Again, not that we use them for anything, but I've heard really good things about it.
How much configuration burden is on the platform team? I think that's an awesome question, Alan. So I'd be curious on your thoughts on this one, Scott. I almost like, because there are some objects that would go in the customer's area. Like I guess it would depend on also the boundary for the tenant. Like if the tenant owns the cluster, it would be different than if the platform team owned the cluster. Like I would see this almost as more silo management than technology management.
Yeah, and this is why I do start the chapter with that word, like you said, Alan. I always like to point that out. People go, "Wow, this is super simple." I'm like, "Yeah, it's because all the heavy lifting's back here, right?" It's like clouds. You click a button, you got Kubernetes. Well, that's got a lot of work on the back end. It's setting up and defining it. Now, once you get the standards set, right, you get your deployment. It's not bad, but what's the big overhead? I think for platform teams is helping the support, right? The questions I get from people that are deploying something. It's a challenge. I think on one of my customer-facing pages, customers are meaning my internal IT teams. They're my customers. I say, look, if you don't know something about Istio, please don't enable it, because it does add these complexities. I hate to say complexities, right? I often question when Kubernetes came out, right? You always heard it's too complex. I said, when did this field become a field that's easy? It never has been. So, it's not that hard to learn it. And I've done sessions. I try to educate internally, like, cool, open session, here's what we can do. Similar to what you were asking, though, Alan, like, why would you care about this? I talk about circuit breaking, injecting faults to see how your app's going to work, stuff you don't necessarily always have without these tools. So I think like anything, we have bruises from originally, implementing it. But I'll give you an example. In my place, it's a standard. Every cluster has it. There is no, hey, I'm going to go into a cluster with Kubernetes or with Istio. It's there. That's how important we do see it. And it is heavily used. I mean, every feature down from simple to complex, and it depends on the team. So there's always gonna be that overhead, but once you get it out there and you learn it, you get your staff. It's really not bad to support.
So I thought I've got my dev cluster here, so maybe we go ahead and just launch Istio into the dev cluster and walk through the lab. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, sounds like a plan to me. At least you get the idea, you get to see it, right? I mean, you can listen to us talk all day and go to sleep, depends, right? Or
in the meanwhile, I have a question while you launch it, Mark. So if the gateway API supports north-south, as you said, and east-west, do we need like Istio with it if we only use like the gateway API? A part of security and those monitoring?
that's a good question, because that's becoming a common question too. And of course, Istio supports the gateway API as well. Actually, it's even nicer having that support. We can talk about that with certificates maybe as we're going through this. It depends. It's going to be the question there. You're not going to get all the features that Istio has, right, in those, but you're going to get some. You definitely do, because Gateway is far more robust. The Kubernetes Gateway. It would be a use case scenario. I hate to be
so, for example, if you don't need all the fancy feature of Istio and you need the basic one which Gateway API covers, it's okay to stick to only Gateway and use all its features.
Yeah, because it gives you pretty good traffic management over, say, like the ingress objects, for an example, right? So that, yes, if that's what you're looking for, then the complexity of Istio probably not there, right? You don't need it, but it doesn't give you those authentication mechanisms, the default, the injection delays for when you're coding. Yeah, but yeah, absolutely. It's nice that you don't have to deploy a whole service mesh then for what really should have been features to begin with. But yeah, you can accomplish a canary deployment that way, or an AB with pretty easy traffic management.
Thank you.
So I got a little bit of a contrary opinion on this one. I think
fight. Let's go, Mark.
Yeah, so well, my perspective is a little bit different in that I do some operations. I'm a vendor, right? Like I write software that I sell to people, and part of that is building in support for the different variances of what we see in the environment. So, and ingress is a big one. And generally the term ingress, not just, the ingress API. And what I find is that the attempt to build a generic ingress or gateway API leads to either one of two scenarios. Either you end up having a least common denominator, which is fine for some things, or you get this mess of annotations all over the place because, every vendor, every project has their own opinion on how they want to implement things. And that's not bad, right? Like that's not negative. That's beautiful, right? Like we all have different ways of doing things. We all have different opinions. And it's how it gets implemented is going to be different for everyone. And so I have found that I would just much rather go to the product or the project's APIs, or manifests natively and do that. Because the thing is that if you're going to deploy Istio as an example, but you do it using the gateway API, the likelihood that you're going to swap out Istio for, let's say, Linkerd and not have to completely re-engineer all of those gateway API manifests is slim to none, right? You're going to have to re-engineer them anyway. And especially as time goes by, when the Ingress gateway or the gateway API came out, everybody was in agreement, but as time goes on, there's going to be more and more drift. And this isn't just an Ingress thing. Like this is any type of standard interface. Like I always go back to databases when I talk about this with folks, and people say, no, gateway API is great. I'm like, I'm sure it's awesome, but anybody who spent any time with databases and realize that you can't use the same SQL on SQL Server that you do on Oracle that you do on MySQL, right? Like they're minor variances, but those variances are there. You can't just drop them in. Okay, in the Java world, we create a whole new framework to manage that and hibernate. My personal recommendation is when you can, go to the native objects for whatever ingress you're using, because you're going to get more bang for your buck. And in the long haul, it's going to be a much better investment than the lowest common denominator that you're going to get from an abstraction.
Thank you.
So I've got chapter 16 open. I actually don't have the, I'm going to do this real quick so I can keep y'all on my screen without, so I can see questions. Where to purchase the 3rd edition? Right now, it's like $30 on Amazon. Like, I'm really annoyed because we're not getting anything out of that. But yeah, I mean, Packet tends to be the cheapest. Amazon right now, it's like $28 US. I don't know if that extends to every country. Unfortunately, I didn't check that, but it is extremely cheap on Amazon right now. My one request is that if you do buy it on Amazon, please, please, please leave a 5-star and a quick note, because that makes a huge difference in where we show up on the list.
Well, let's be fair. Whatever star everybody thinks it is, but we prefer 5. Don't get me wrong.
I'm sticking with where I was. 5-star.
Don't blame you.
And then the other thing that I did not realize, and I don't know if you realize this, Scott, you buy the Dead Tree edition, the paper version, Packet will give you the PDF for free.
I think I did know that. Yeah, I think I
did not realize that. So get the paper book, because I mean that's just more fun, and you get the PDF to be able to copy and paste everything out of, and then in the mTLS, yeah, we talked about that one. Okay, so I've got, where I started was all of our chapters start off with deploy a cluster. So we include this, again, massive props to Scott because he engineered this. It just downloads kind, it gets Docker set up, it gets everything up and running. So we've got I'm not typing into my control get pods all. So I'm gonna go ahead and hide that. So no, there we go. Okay. So that gets us. So we've got a running Kubernetes deployment with Ingress Engine X, which we'll get rid of in a second. So there are a bunch of manual steps so that you can see what's going on, but Scott's also got this handy dandy install Istio. So I'm just going to run that. So that's doing all the hard work of downloading the right version of Istio, getting it installed, getting the demo profile up and running, getting all the CRDs, all that good stuff installed. And this one's actually usually pretty straightforward.
Might be not important to point out, Mark, that here it is. So we're getting rid of Ingress. Now, the only reason we're doing that, of course, I for instance, in production, I run both, right? Because we have Nginx for normal everyday Ingress. I'm not going to use it for the service mesh only. We're running kind, right? We're going to be kind of limited in what we can do. We can't just have 443 on 2 different, I'm going to say IPs. If you had 2 IPs, you could do something different. But so we get rid of it and then basically relink the Istio gateway to do 443. And you can probably show that now, Mark, with your get pods.
Yeah, so kube control, get pods. Of course, I don't know how to type. That's what, Istio system?
Yes.
Yeah. So we got all of our pods right. I'm just gonna make this bigger, make it a little easier for folks to see. So we've got Istio running. So I mean, considering how complex Istio is, the fact that you can actually get it up and running in a demo environment that quickly is pretty impressive. Granted, it's not a production environment. That's always the trick. So where things really start to get interesting for me personally in this chapter, once you get everything set up, we walk through different authorization policies and how they're kind of tricky in Istio land, and they're really easy to trip yourself up because of, and on page 490, Scott's got a really good diagram of like, I'll bring this down here. Of like, this is how, this is how the authorization policies make their decision. And it's really weird to me where it's like, oh, there is no policy, then, maybe it's denied, maybe it's not. I know this one tripped me up, especially when we get into the next chapter, when we start talking about authentication and the way authentication and authorization kind of meld in Istio. Anything you want to say on this one, Scott?
No, and the reason I even did this chart, we had in the second edition too, was because I have the bruises from it, not just personally, but from, my customers. I did this, suddenly it's not working, and I'm like, bet I know what the problem is. I'm like, yeah, because you don't have this one created. Well, I did this one. I go, yeah, but Istio is kind of interesting when you have one, but don't have one here. And so this is published, for an example, very similar to our intranet, Confluence sites to say, okay, if you're having an error, go check this.
Now, let's see. Once you have executed the scripts, test Nginx is working. So let's see here. I'm going to go ahead and
create not Nginx, right? Istio Ingress Gateway.
Istio Ingress Gateway.
So I hope it's not
No,
Nginx.
didn't you
That won't
deploy
work.
an Nginx in?
No, this one I got so you got deploy test app. Mark, there's a script.
Did I skip that part?
Yeah, just scroll down just a little bit. Oh, yeah, go back up where you were. But so you should see the test app directory.
Test app. Yep.
Yep. So go into that, and if you kind of ls that, yeah. So you see, this is just to show you that the Ingress gateway is working. So we're going to create, obviously, a gateway will create a virtual service, and you can see all that in here, right? So when I wrote a lot of the scripts, you can see all the headings that we do just to say, okay, this is what I'm creating. And that's what we're kind of self-documenting the scripts with, to say, here's what these operations all do.
All right.
And if you were to go into that one, I even forgot what it is.
No, it's just my Mac being, let's see, an error occurred. Test app.
Live demos, always great.
I think I skipped a step. Expose Istio. No. Pods and Istio system.
No, that's probably, look at the services quick, Mark.
Maybe under Istio Ingress.
That's there, and what I'm warning is make sure the service.
There's not going to be a load balancer, which is fine. But we should have.
Right. No, we exposed it at the
container
level. Yeah. So if you look at that,
and,
I mean, you can even look at the script for expose.
Control edit deployment.
Yeah, it should just be Istio Ingress Gateway. Ingress Gateway is one word. Yeah.
Of course. This is why I love dashboards. All right. What do we got here?
It'd be down.
Host. No. see, ports.
Yeah, host port 80, host port 433. Yep, that's in there.
Okay. So then,
curl it
is
on this host mark. See if that'll get
Yeah.
your Mac out of the way to see if that's the problem. Well, I was thinking about the virtual service that got created. But that'll at least tell you something. Yeah. Okay, so no error on that. So the port's opened.
It's interesting. HTTPS. No, let's try this.
Or they
Maybe
curl that in your. That's just
There we
real
go. Yeah, because we don't have SSL set up on the on Istio by
Oh,
default.
you just default. Yeah, I didn't
Yeah.
realize you had yes in there. Cool. So
So
that shows the gateway and the virtual service working.
so we go through here, we do the authorizations. So we did the curl. And then let's go ahead. We'll create a policy that will deny all requests to the resource. All right.
Yep, because it's already in the test app.
Is it in the test app?
Yeah, well, I even have the policy in there. So what we did in the chapter is different from the second edition. We had more code in the actual printed pages. We needed that space for all the additions that we added. So certain scripts we do put in the book still to show you certain things, but we try to give you scripts for all of it so you can just run them.
Where's the?
You probably didn't deploy the policy yet, right?
Oh, well, that's right.
there
So
you
it's
go.
probably
I think it's the example
one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yep.
All right. So control create F example one. So once this is created, we shouldn't be able to access anymore, right?
I don't know. These live demos are scary.
There we go.
Yeah. Access
So it took a second.
So we go into here. Yeah, like it does take a couple, eventual consistency, right?
is it layer 7, right? This is layer 7. Layer 7 other policy.
I'm sorry?
I don't think they're layer 7. I think they're layer, well.
Is this layer 7 policy?
They'll be layer 4. Because if you're using mTLS, I think it'll still kick in, right, Scott?
Well, it depends on what you're doing. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the whole question actually, Mark. So Istio policies typically do operate at layer 7.
So it's a layer 7 policy.
Yeah, I think you might be thinking Mark network policies, which do layer 4.
Right, but I'm trying to, because basically the big thing with ambient mesh is that it doesn't do much of any layer 7 stuff. So I think the authorization policies still work.
There's probably something, but most of the policies you're doing, you're going to say elements of like, I don't know, I'm going to say the username in that.
That's a good
7.
point. I think you're right, actually.
Yeah, when you get into 4, you'd be doing more about IP.
Yeah.
Right. Now that does get interesting because you can block CIDR ranges, but that's still coming in the incoming host in the header because it knows where you're coming from.
Oh, yes. True.
Yes.
If you use the header, then it's L7.
Yeah, so
always a good question because people say this with network policies and that too.
Yeah, exactly. Like, because I said, okay, so it looks like a network policy where you have like a default denial.
Yeah, it gets confusing to keep them all straight away. Okay, yeah, it works at 7, it works at 4. Okay, so yeah, we update what we're doing here, another policy. So we're actually going to say, okay, now we're going to allow get.
Oh, okay. So the policies can live with each other, right? So I didn't actually have to delete the old one.
You do not have to delete the old one, no.
All right, let me recreate it and make sure that that's still working. There we go. Okay, so we got RBAC denied. So now let's go ahead and do the second one, which allows it based on a get operation. So now that should work. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
But if we did
You try to do like a post or something, right? It,
yeah. Curl the X post.
Airbag.
and
There we go.
access denied.
Urban. Yep.
Oh, and what is the order? So if you have now two authorization policies, you have like one and two. Which one take precedence?
So you're talking about like conflicting rules. Oh, why am I forgetting this? I think it's the deny that wins.
I think you're right, Scott. If
This is,
it evaluates
yeah.
all of them, and if any of them are denied, then it'll all the policies that end up applying have to be allowed in order for the request to be allowed. If any deny, so it's not really an ordering thing. Like it's not like ACLs, or firewall rules.
Yeah, WAF, the WAF one.
Yeah, it's they all get evaluated, and if any of them are denied, the whole thing is denied.
I've got a cold today, so I was warning Mark that I'm not on all cylinders. So my thought process is not quick today. I'm on Dayquil to try to just function.
Where did everybody else go? Okay, we're back.
So then we get through those examples, which are quick ones, right? Because in the next chapter, Mark, you get into more of those.
Yeah. And then we get into gateways.
Yeah, and the gateways is something I like to kind of bring up. We really don't dive into this too much in the chapter, Mark, but you know this happens. I think from the previous calls, everybody knows we're big multi-tenant fans, right? It's pretty common, especially for utilizing resources correctly. There's one downfall to that with Istio, though, major downfall. If you want to use a custom certificate in your namespace, that certificate must reside in Istio system. Okay, now you should see a problem with that, right? The last thing you want to do is give 100 developers, 1,000 developers access to Istio system to create secrets. They could just whack everybody else's secret, right? Accidentally, on purpose, whatever. So it's something you run into. Now, I've accomplished something at my day job where I let developers create that secret in their namespace, and I'm watching for an annotation, and I replicate it into Istio system so they can use it. But if you use the Kubernetes gateway object, though, with Istio, that is not a limitation. So just want to call it out, adding it here. So if you're going to use a native Istio gateway, you're kind of stuck with TLS, has to exist in Istio system. If you're going to use a Kubernetes gateway, you can get away from that. It's a little bit more robust. It kind of comes up in a lot of headaches with mTLS. There's just certain apps that might want to do their own mTLS, so they got to get a cert, and it has to be a custom cert.
And just to be clear, when you say cert, you're not talking about the cert that's used east-west, right? You're not talking about the certs that are used between pods. You're talking about ingress into the cluster from the outside world.
Yes. So we're not replacing Citadel with anything, right? So yeah, the internal is going to be the self-signs still. But that's part of the problem. So what we're running here, guys, obviously, is we're using built-in Istio certs. The second you start trying to do an mTLS like outside your cluster, that's an incredibly bad idea, right? I mean, you want issued certs from your own certificate authorities. And that's where you might want to, so you might keep it running like this intra-cluster, but when you go across the clusters or incoming traffic, you then want to say, oh, I want to do mTLS with an actual, issued enterprise cert from our CA authority. And in that case, you would have to change your TLS down here where the key is to the custom one.
Well, so I'm gonna chime in here a little bit. The technology to do that is not hard at all, right? Like going to a CA and saying, give me what's called an intermediate cert, an intermediate CA cert. So it's a key in a certificate that says it has been issued by the main CA, but it is also able to issue certificates. And so you give Istio this private key in cluster, and it'll just like a cert is a cert from a CA. Like it doesn't care if it's a local CA that it generated the keys for, or if it's a CA from someplace else. Where it becomes a problem, though, is policy. because the enterprise CAs, there's a book somewhere that like, I don't, this was popular once upon a time where whenever they talked about the US budget process, they would, print out the budget in book form and stack them on tables until the table breaks. Those books are not as big as the CA policy guide that you have to follow. And so it's not a technology issue, it's a compliance issue. And the war between compliance and security, compliance wins every time. So, trying to go cross cluster, you either have to create your own CA, which usually runs afoul of most compliance because, if you're in cluster, and I've seen this at multiple organizations. If you're talking within the cluster and the traffic doesn't leave the cluster, compliance doesn't care. You're within that boundary. Nobody's going to really get upset about it. But once you leave that boundary and it goes across your larger network, now compliance starts to kick in and they say, no, it has to be signed by one of our CA certificates. Say, okay, give me a CA certificate, and they just kind of laugh at you and walk away. Or they call the cops. So.
And this is beyond what we were doing in the book, because that's a pretty big topic, right, Mark, to get into.
Yeah, and so that's where the discussion of east-west versus north-south. North-south, you're usually doing JOTs because now the JOTs, even though it's still PKI, you don't run into the same compliance issues because you're not dealing with TLS connections.
Yep.
So we're talking more about the gateway. Then we get into the virtual service. And this was one that, like, when I first started with Istio, really tripped me up because I was coming from the ingress and Nginx land where it's like, here's the ingress object. It just works. Realizing that, like, well, first you have to deploy your gateway because that's where the traffic is coming in. Then you have to link up to your virtual service and say, okay, this is, I'm going to connect this service to this host because you can have this many-to-many relationship between the services and the hosts. And figuring out what those destinations are. And then how did we cover routes in I don't think we do this chapter. I think we actually cover that.
I just so what I did in this chapter for everybody is almost like the Kubernetes boot camp. It's okay, here's the resources. We may not talk about all of them in this chapter, but it's meant for the reference of when if you were to do a get CRD, for an example, in your cluster, and you see all these Istio ones, this is what they do. Again, like Chad said at the beginning, there's books on this, right? There's 300-400 page books on just Istio. We were hoping to just get the idea across because those questions come up, why a service mesh? And it was, okay, here's some cool features for it and to play with it.
Yeah, and like we get into authentication here. I'm kind of skimming through these because I want to get to
like 6 minutes officially, so.
Yeah, I want to try and get to the pet shop, and we also cover these in the next chapter. We dive a lot more into them. One of the things that Scott points out here was the service entry, where like if you don't have it, your environment or the sidecar
or the sidecar, you can use either.
Yeah,
I like sidecar because that's the hand grenade effect, as I was saying. It's okay. Here's what's in the mesh. Anything not listed in this is outside the mesh, which means basically the sidecar is going to let it bypass. Right? Without that, you try to connect to an Oracle server, for an example, outside. You don't get it. Interesting enough, I've seen it work once in a great while. It typically blocks it, but that's what we're talking about in there. And then we got the Envoy filters and WASM.
And we don't do anything with WASM in the next chapter. We do use a Envoy filter in the next chapter to do authorization to an OPA policy.
Oh yes. Careful if you ever use Envoy filters to everybody, because there are things you can do wrong in there that'll break Istio, especially the upgrade process.
Come back here. Nope, wrong one.
There probably won't be any time to deploy key out and everything.
Let's see here. Let's play. How fast can we deploy? So let's go to Kiali. And again, Scott has this set up so that it all just goes.
Yeah, I love showing Kiali. It's one of my favorite demos for mesh.
And we have a lot of fun with Kiali in the next chapter too. The thing we spend a lot of time in the next chapter on while this is loading up is how we treat monoliths versus microservices in a service mesh, and like how those things come together. Because a lot of times when we talk about service mesh, we're talking about, oh, there we go. We're talking about, wait, I see Kiali. I don't see Jaeger or.
No, those are deployed in command line, I believe.
Are they?
Yeah, you kind of, it's in the chapters. If you go, you're going down, you gotta go back up. Yeah, so there you got, there's Prometheus, Grafana.
Oh, deploy add-ons. Here we go.
Yeah. I didn't want to, I wanted to break it up a little bit in the book. Yeah, so there you got the, in the, yep, there you go.
There we go. So I'll take a hot second to deploy.
Broke them up because these are more like a prereq. Kiali doesn't come with those, right? It's okay here. You want to have these. That came out pretty quick. Cool.
Yeah, it's actually going pretty well. Well, I did replace the hard drive on this with an SSD, so it's kind of a screaming eagle.
Yeah.
So we did that.
You should have your Kiali address on there.
I want to go ahead and deploy our app. CD example app. This one takes a while, doesn't it?
This is pretty big.
It's the pet shop, isn't it?
No, it's the Anthos shop. It's not pet shop.
Ah, that's right. It's not pet shop.
I forgot what they call it. It's like vintage cameras and stuff like that. It has some great services in it.
So let me go ahead, come back here. Well, let's see.
And as you see this, guys, I mean, it's for you that played with Istio, you'll see the pods are 2 of 2. It's because it's the main pod and the sidecar.
If it's just Kiali, right?
Yes. If it's not, then I don't know why.
There we go.
Cool.
So
you got default. We should have the demo app there, right? Yeah, there's demo.
Just go with demo. Cool. So I love dashboards. Like I'm a huge fan of dashboards. You just can't get this much information visually that you do. Like look, like
especially this.
You know, you can't do that with APIs directly. Like you can't get that much information.
I mean, CLIs are great, but yeah, like you're saying, Mark, this is just you kind of need this to see it.
And like we probably gotta wait for it to be up and running. But like I love. Oh, it is up and running. All right, let's try this. So if I go to demo.
Yeah, we'll get some traffic. Do I have
It is demo. Yep. There we go. So, I'm just going to click around. I'm going to add to cart. Like, I'm not going to do anything special with it, right? I'm going to place my order. But now, do I have it enabled? Because don't you have to enable, let's see, traffic?
You do. So right now, there's a load generator too. Mark, I don't remember if I deploy it by default. I'm taking a look at the scripts. So the demo that we have on there is not, I take no credit for it. It's Google's. The people that wrote it, it's a lot in it, to be honest. And let me just go to the chapter. Because in the example app.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah, I should have deployed it because there should be traffic already happening.
Traffic animation. That's what I want.
There you go. so that the load generator is running, or else you wouldn't see this traffic. So that happens to a lot of people. They'll do a test app and say, oh, I don't see anything. Well, there's no traffic, right? You have to be watching it. So Google includes a generator. So in all these lines too, Mark, you can actually enable the latency in there as well.
Display.
So you have to have Istio in order to run Kiali?
You
Yeah.
do, yes.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, so
Cool.
if you click on the traffic rate, for an example, or even like throughput, you get some cool stuff. I also use it to show the security sometimes, just in demos, because now if you zoom in, you should see more, because you're zoomed out, you're not going to see anything.
Yeah, how do I zoom in?
From this part, I think you can just use your mouse wheel. Yeah, there you go.
Okay, there we go.
You can see, there you go. Now you're getting your, 240, requests per second. And this is great. Now, granted, it's real time, right, guys? But there is some, you can do playback on this as well. It's not like you're going to go back for weeks by default, and we don't have a ton to go back to. But if somebody said 10 minutes ago this happened, you're going to be like, oh, great, that's not going to help. I got to go get the logs. Well, you can actually replay it. So you can choose the time and replay it, and you might even see that delay. So you might see one of these sections going to 10,000 milliseconds. I'm just grabbing a number, right? And says, wow, that's a problem. There's even one of the views where you can do show security, and it shows you a little lock in between all the lines to show you that mTLS is in fact enabled. I think it's in the display part, Mark.
No.
No, not that one. Right there. It used to be at the bottom.
Yep, security.
So this is just to verify. You see the little locks? That just shows you have mTLS between everything. Great to show security people. Right, to say, yep, that's there. If I didn't have one of those, because maybe you made an exception to that, it would not show that. I think it actually shows the lock unlocked. You can see why it's one of my favorite demo things. So you can see all this stuff on the side too, under workloads and services. You can see everything. Distributed tracing might pull up Jaeger. I think this configuration would work, Mark, but I'm not 100% positive. It's been a while. Yeah. So if you wanted to get more deep into your tracing, you can just go right to Jaeger on it. In the search, I think, Mark, the main screen you were on, if you do a drop down on the services. So this is all the demos because that's all we're running, right? So I would do front end, potentially. Up on the, and then maybe just say find traces. So you can get into more of your details, right? Kind of like what AppD would do for you, like in an APM side. And we're just looking at the front end on this one, right? So we could look at more, and you see in the chart all the way down. Just one of the coolest free tools. I'm going to say open source tools out there. At least ever since they added the ability to do token authentication, which was about 3 years ago, Mark, maybe roughly.
Jaeger, yeah.
At one time, you had to have a service account in the namespace to
or rather, Kiali.
Yeah, and then they added token auth to it, which is great because now, like in something like Open Unison, we have a little badge that we use that you click, jot is passed with it, and you only get access to what you have. Not a big fan of maintaining a separate identity management like in a product to say, okay, great, Chad should have access to this, Jack should have access to this. I don't want to deal with that. You got a jot token with all your groups and your names. Cool. Just work. And it's great for that.
Yeah. And the fun thing is we get to dive into that in the next chapter too. So we get to show that off a little bit because this is not very enterprisey when it's like anonymous access.
Just meant to deploy it and get it ready. Yeah. Or else the chapter would be like 80 pages. It just keeps growing.
Exactly.
So I think we're out of time on that one, Mark. I mean, I'm all for it. I'll stick around. But
yeah, I was going to open the floor to any quick questions if anybody wants to ask real quick. Otherwise, Chad, I think we covered the chapter here.
Yeah, just to close things out, and great job. The demo gods were in your favor today, so that really worked out well.
I
And
managed to sacrifice a live chicken before the before the
as you do.